Welcome to Space Matters, the Space Governance Podcast, where the Australasian Centre for Space Governance invites experts from across the Asia-Pacific region and around the world to discuss with us the most pressing issues of space governance, policy, and law. We explore the ways in which we all depend on space-based technologies for our daily lives, our national and regional needs. We're curious about the different roles that industry, academia, and government can play in defining global space infrastructure. And we investigate the influence of smaller countries and middle powers in the region on global space governance and the opportunity of greater space cooperation across the Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific. The Australasian Centre for Space Governance is a not-for-profit association. We're a transdisciplinary hub bridging expertise in space law, policy, history, political and social sciences to advocate and shape perspectives on responsible space governance, ensuring that space supports well-being, prosperity and sustainability for current and future generations across the Asia-Pacific. We acknowledge that many members of the ACSG live and work on Indigenous country. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations as knowledge holders of responsible governance of land, waters, and skies. Hi, welcome to this next episode of Space Matters, the Space Governance Podcast. I'm Cassandra Steer, CEO of the Australasian Centre for Space Governance. And in today's episode, it's a conversation between myself and Andre Kwok, who is our research assistant. He's been with the ACSG for about 2 years now. Andre and I first met when he was a student of mine at the Australian National University Law School, when he was doing his dual degree there. And I taught him a few different subjects. We go into the history of how we met, but not just because we are interested in our own past, but because it's another example of the winding path that people take into burgeoning careers in space governance, space law, and other space humanities areas. Andre is a young professional. He currently works in a position in the Australian government. We're very lucky that he's able to continue his work with us as a research assistant next to that full-time job. We benefit a great deal from his enthusiasm, his mastering of all of the things we need to do for our website, our communications, but he's also brought a lot of really substantive grit to what we do. He has provided a lot of research on some papers he and I have worked on together, op-eds, that kind of thing as well. And he's the one who brought the idea of introducing a theme into our Space Matters podcast that focuses on space in the Asia-Pacific. That goes really nicely with our expansion as a centre. Since we've become incorporated and a not-for-profit, we changed our name from the Australian Centre for Space Governance to the Australasian Centre for Space Governance. We speak a little bit about that also in our conversation. But the point is to really widen the lens to what's going on in the region, what the opportunities are when countries who are neighbours in the Asia-Pacific region expand on not only their civil space capabilities and their cooperation on developing capabilities that we need, potentially also for our space defense capabilities, but also the opportunity that provides in terms of it being a policy lever for a range of other issues that we are committed to in the Asia-Pacific region. Andre has a particular interest in this because of his background in Asian studies, international affairs, and also international law as part of his law degree. And he will be hosting a lot of the conversations as we move forward that fall under this theme. We have a slew of really fascinating people who we'll be speaking to from across Australia and across a range of other countries in the region, who work in industry, in academia, other research centres and think tanks and that kind of thing, touching on a lot of issues that are equally political and technological. We're just so grateful for all the work that Andre does, and I really enjoyed this conversation with him. We dove deep on a lot of kind of unexpected tangents that actually are really important and quite a rich contribution to why this theme is so important. So without further ado, enjoy this conversation between Andre and myself about space in Asia Pacific. Welcome to this episode of Space Matters. I'm Cassandra Steer, CEO of the Australasian Centre for Space Governance, and we're going to speak to that name change in a moment because we used to be the Australian Centre for Space Governance. Having a coffee and a chat with Andre Kwok, who is our research assistant, who is the heart and soul of all of our media and communications, our website and everything, and an amazing researcher as well. Hi, Andre. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you, Cassandra?
I'm doing well. It's nighttime for me. It's coffee time for you. So
Yeah, it was peak coffee time.
So Andrew, because we start every single episode asking our guest how their journey into space or to a career in space, tell us about yours. What was your journey into space and the other studies that you did that led you there?
This is a really cool story because, Cassandra, I actually learned about space through you. I remember in 2020, during my second year of my law degree, I did a compulsory subject called Lawyers, Justice, and Ethics, and you happened to be my tutor. And I remember week one, I rocked up and you introduced yourself saying that you just moved to Australia. I think it's like your third month after living overseas for 20 years, and you were talking about space law, and I was like, what's space law? Then you started talking about it. I thought it was really cool, and I've had the chance to do ethics with you, did international law with you, and did the space governance elective that you did at ANU a few years after. But I think with my story, so I did a double degree, Bachelor's of Asian Studies and Laws at ANU. So Asian Studies is very culture, society, politics, history. It's a very design your own journey type of degree. Initially, I was quite interested in conflict, reconciliation in Asia, Southeast Asia, and I had the privilege of studying and working in Cambodia, Singapore, and Myanmar. And I think after a few years, I became interested in how technology was changing conflict and how conflicts were fought, how people engaged in war zones, and I feel that lined up really nicely with space. And I'm really interested to see how these questions about conflict, security, and peace and security evolve in new domains like space. That's my journey.
Mm-hmm. I didn't know you'd been to Myanmar, but I knew about your other journeys and studies, but Myanmar as well. And because I remember one of the conversations that we had, I can't remember when it was because COVID time is a fuzz in my head, but I think it was while you were doing the space law course in 2021. And you were telling me about Asian studies, and you were telling me about some of the travels you had done and the travels you wanted to do, and also your own mixed background and that the cultural influences that's given you the different perspective. And then we were talking about, it must have been towards the end of Trump 1.0. We were talking about where is this going? What does this mean? And I was talking about the end of the American century, and you said, yeah, it's already the Asian century. And it took me a moment because social scientists in Australia and in the Asia Pacific region have been using that term for quite some time. But it's only under Trump 2.0 that we're really seeing people go, oh, it is the end of Pax Americana. It is the end of the American century. And an instant fear that China might take over. But the Asian century is a much more complex and exciting period that I think we're entering. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what did Asian century mean to you as a student of Asian studies, and does it mean something different to you now?
Yeah, I love that question, Cassandra. So for some background, my parents immigrated to Australia from Hong Kong. So I've always thought, well, I was born after the handover from the UK to China, but I thought that whole concept was really, really interesting as a kid when I was researching about it. But as an Asian studies student, so I did the Bachelor's of Asian Studies at ANU. So so it wasn't a Bachelor's of Arts, it was a separate degree. And I think at that time, ANU was one of the very few, it's quite possible it's the only university in Australia that has a separate degree designated to Asian studies.
Mm.
Even though I didn't do that many security and international relations focused subjects, I did more culture and sociology. But there was a big emphasis on we should be looking at our neighbors. Indonesia is so close. They're one of the largest growing economies in the world. There's a huge population, so close to Australia. How can we develop better people-to-people links with our neighbors? Because I'm still quite passionate about this topic is about learning languages and our cultural competency in Australia, right? We're one of the most multicultural places on earth, but we're still quite monolingual. And I feel there's a lot of not wasted. I think there could be opportunities for closer collaboration because we have such an interesting and rich group of countries that surround us. Like we're not far from, like Singapore, we've got New Zealand, we've got East Timor, like there's so much
Mm.
action happening in our backyard, and I think we could engage and learn from them all.
Yeah, look, 100%. I mean, and I think that was one of the things that we discussed at the time too, because I, having lived and studied in Europe, learned Dutch as a second language, then I learned French as my third language, still very Western languages, but at least they gave me access to different, like our language constructs reality. So when you're speaking different languages, particularly if you learn that language within the culture that it comes from and not learn it from a book, you you really start to see the world differently through that cultural lens, through that construction of reality, through that identity. And I think if we're going to do well in this Asian century, as any country, as any community of nations, we have to speak more than one language, quite literally. How many languages do you speak?
So I speak obviously English. I speak Cantonese with my parents. I study Hindi at ANU. I don't think I'm that good, like looking back at it now, but it was a fun like learning experience. And I don't know, like I still remember like I was doing really dry compulsory law subjects. It was really nice having like doing a Hindi minor. But again, I feel like what I really loved about my Hindi experience is that I feel like it was that chapter of my life where I could learn something for the sake of learning. Like I really
Mm,
enjoyed it. But yes, I also did Hindi and I studied Japanese in high school. So I would
mm.
say confident in English, Chinese, Japanese, and if I picked up my textbook again, I could give some basic Hindi a shot.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, when I went to high school in Australia in the 80s and 90s, we didn't it wasn't offered. We were offered German and French. I think by the time my brother was in school, he could learn Indonesian perhaps.
Yeah.
And then when my daughter entered into daycare and preschool in the 2020s, she was learning Wiradjuri, so she was learning an indigenous language. There was a
Oh,
Chinese educator getting them to learn colors and numbers and singing in Chinese. And there was an educator from Colombia, so she was teaching them Spanish. So she had, it was just embedded already in her early learning, which I think is how we need to approach it.
and I think language, sorry, Cassandra. I think what I really like about studying languages and just studying cultural studies in general, I think the idea of just like getting to talk and interact with people from different like journeys and different countries and different belief systems is just a really enjoyable experience. It really broadens your perspectives, especially when it comes to issues like, space and international
Mm-hmm.
law and like big picture multilateral issues. I think it's really important. Sorry, back to you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is. It's enjoyable, but I think it's a responsibility of a huge Western nation that's actually in the Asia Pacific to start to take its geographic location to be part of its identity. So there was another thing where we had a crossover, although it was after you had done subjects with me at the university, after you graduated, I think, in fact, that you went to Cambodia and worked at the Extraordinary Criminal Chambers of Cambodia. And that was a crossover because I myself had come from international criminal law into space law. And indeed, that journey for me was really, as you said, looking at, well, what is technology doing to warfare? What is it doing to responsibility in terms of criminal responsibility? What is it doing to the division between state versus individual actor? Which is part of the pathway that led me to space and space security. And so when you came back from being at the Cambodian tribunal, at the chambers there, you were also talking about not only what you'd learned about the procedures and processes of international criminal law, but you saw Earth observation data in the courtroom. You saw space and ICL coming together. Tell us about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, so I was extremely fortunate to have the chance to work at the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, often known as the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, right at the end of the final verdict. So it was against Q Sampan, the former head of state of the Khmer Rouge regime, and yeah, it was just a really great opportunity to see like the end point of like a genocide trial and seeing a lot of the evidence, like a lot of negotiations, like the whole winding up of the court infrastructure. And through that process and some discussions I've had with some of the lawyers there, Earth declassified like Earth observation data was admitted as evidence in some of the earlier cases at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, right? Because Cassandra, we've had conversations about this. Like to prove international crimes, it's really like tricky, right? Like I think like a lot of the times the witnesses are unavailable because they're just unable to come to the courtroom, or unfortunately they've like passed away. And a lot of
Mhm.
the places where these crimes are being committed, they're not allowing investigators to get in, so they rely on a lot of forensic evidence. So yeah, like it was really interesting because even though the crimes committed during the Khmer Rouge era were in the 1970s, EO
Mhm.
data still used. And looping back to what I said earlier about spending time in Myanmar, I think this speaks to a broader pattern of digital forensics. Like social media was used to incite violence in Myanmar, but at the same time, we're also relying on those same technologies to identify like perpetrators and how that
Mm.
fits to the criminal investigations process. So yes, so it's really interesting to see how all these threads um, come together. And even in Cambodia right now, there's a lot of like capacity building projects happening right now to train like lawyers and judges on how to use like technology in their trial processes. So yeah.
It's fascinating. And it is a really nice crossover because when I was doing my PhD, the ECC, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal was still very new. And some of the first judgments and the first cases were underway, and the first procedural judgments were coming out, which I was citing in my PhD. So the fact that you got to be there at the winding up of this whole criminal justice project is pretty cool. And I think we're going to have later on. So the part of the point of us having this conversation is that we are introducing the fact that there's going to be a theme that we come back to in this podcast quite often around space in the Asia Pacific. So it's going to be a whole kind of bannerhead theme, and we're going to come back to the use of EO data in the courtroom. When you have some special guests from Europe who are experts in precisely that question. But let's talk about that. Why did we think that we need to have an Asia Pacific theme? I guess the first thing I would say about it is that indeed we have changed our name as a centre from the Australian Centre for Space Governance. We were established early in 2021 as a virtual centre made up of researchers from across Australia to fill a gap in Australia. So humanities experts, social science, political science, law, history, space archaeology, space and property. And it was really to fill a gap in Australia at a time where the Space Agency was still only a few years old. We saw some predominant singular voices from industry singing a certain tune about, and there was a competition between people in industry about which particular capabilities should be funded under the very limited funding that was available. And it was an internal competition, and there was no coherent messaging to government nor to the public about why space capabilities and technologies matter. Why does the average person in Australia care? Why should we be spending money on any of this? And indeed to try and support the Australian Space Agency to message across government to that extent, and message to industry and message to the public. And our intention at the beginning, we actually thought about naming ourselves the Asia Pacific Centre. But when we were setting ourselves up, we were 100% white Australians. So we didn't feel that there was no integrity in calling ourselves an Asia Pacific or an Australasian Centre at the start. And we had a very specific focus to get some messaging sorted out in Australia that we thought was kind of going in the wrong direction, and to bring our expertise to bear on that. Now that we've been around for a few years, as of 2025, we are now incorporated as an association. We're still going through the processes of being recognised as a charity, but we will become a not-for-profit. But we are an independent entity. We're no longer under the bannerhead of the ANU Institute for Space. We're no longer part of the university. We're still mostly made up of those Australian academics from various parts around the country. But we are striving to, not only in terms of the substance and our focus, but also in terms of our research collaborations and connections, really striving to open up the focus to the Asia Pacific. So with that, we've actually come up with a new mission statement, which is that the Australasian Centre for Space Governance advocates for responsible laws, norms, and policies on space activities to foster sustainability, security, and shared prosperity across the Asia Pacific. And I think this is the perfect moment for us to make that shift because, as I've said many times, and as I think many in the centre have said, there's a massive policy lever opportunity for Australia in partnership with other countries in the region to think about space cooperation, civil space cooperation in particular, as a lever to achieve the things we're committed to in the region, our shared interests, our shared needs. So Earth observation data to help us track the health of fresh water, for example, or illegal fishing, or the rise of sea level, which is an existential threat to island nations in our neighbourhood. Connectivity via satellite communications for remote, rural and regional communities, which is a massive issue for Pacific Island nations and communities in various countries in our neighbourhood and also in Australia. Having, reliable position navigation and timing, which is at the moment, we all depend on GPS for free. That's an American military capability that most of the world uses for free. But if that is being attacked or jammed or interfered with by actors who have something out against the US, there might be any a couple of those. That means we lose GPS. And that means our farmers and agricultural companies and farmers in countries in our neighbourhood lose a capability that they depend on for their farming equipment, for their precision sowing, for their irrigation. So primary industries in our region depend on space in so many ways. Online education for remote communities and island communities. But at the same time, space remains difficult. It remains expensive. Space is hard. So the best way for us to achieve our national and regional interests and to shore up the region so that smaller nations don't have to turn, for example, to China for those capabilities, the best way to do that is to be building that infrastructure together. So we don't have to foot the bill individually. We don't have to have debates about what Australia should be doing, sovereign or not. We can build it together with other nations in the region. And some countries are way out ahead of us on this. Japan is, South Korea is, the Philippines are. So there's a lot for us to learn as well. And that led you to suggest we should have a kind of a theme, a bannerhead of podcast episodes that talk about space in the Asia Pacific. So I've had a bit of a rant now. It's your chance to have a rant.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cassandra. And I completely agree with you, right? Because I think the first layer is I feel the geopolitics are really changing in our region. And Cassandra, we've had many conversations about this. Like, we are in a multipolar reality now. It's not two countries exerting their influence, but there's a lot of different clusters of influence. And I'm quite passionate about space diplomacy and science diplomacy, especially in the context in Australia right now, where I think R&D is a very contentious topic, but it may interest listeners to know that in several countries in the Asia Pacific region, I know South Korea, Japan, China, and several Southeast Asian countries have really intensified their political and financial support for R&D, including space. And I feel with Australia's geographic proximity to a lot of these like Asia Pacific countries, and also the fact that we are in the Asia Pacific region, there are just so many opportunities to make sure that we are aligned, our structures are aligned, and we're talking to like the key people to make sure we're not like duplicating on particular things, but also we can have like a coordinated approach to certain key issues, like what you said about like climate change, disaster response, and how we can use space to increase like policing and justice issues in the region. So yeah, I think the proximity is the key thing for me.
Mm. Yeah, so exactly, geographical proximity and also our economic interdependency, right? I mean, if you think about APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, so there's 21 Asia Pacific economies that make up APEC. And the statistic I have in front of me, APEC's member economies are home to more than 2.9 billion people collectively and make up over 60% of GDP. The majority of GDP comes from APEC. And I think there's an enormous power in that. There's also a power, because you mentioned we're in a multipolar era, what middle powers and what smaller countries can do in this new era. It's, it's new. It's been emerging for several years, but it's in our face right now with things going on. What middle powers and smaller nations can do when they work together is more than what competing greater powers can do on their own. And, I think I would put India as a rising greater power. It's definitely more than a middle power, really carving out its own trajectory and its own, it doesn't want to be seen to be taking sides between China and the US, for example. And we have huge trade relations and commercial relations with India. We have increasing space cooperation with India. But how can we turn that into also helping to shape India's responsible behaviors in space, for example? How do we do that through the Quad, which is Japan, Australia, the US, and India? How do we utilize our very strong partnership with Japan and South Korea, not only as regional middle powers, but also as very strong space partners to then influence what's happening? I mean, I think it was Hugh White, who's a professor at ANU, who mentioned recently that Indonesia is very quickly becoming the world's fourth largest economy. I mean, I don't think we realize just how powerful the economy is in the region.
And I also feel like another thing I really wanted to point out is that Southeast Asia is also home to some of the world's like youngest countries. I think there's also a demographic
Mm.
element to it as well. Like that's like
Ah,
a lot of economists who have done research like linking like age and like predicting like the future profile of economies in like Southeast Asia. I think if you include Timor-Leste, who's the candidate country for ASEAN, but I understand I think it's Cambodia or Laos, which is some of the youngest populations in Southeast Asia, and they have some really interesting like economic forecasting as well. And another thing that I'm really passionate about on this topic is the fact that space can feed into a lot of broader agendas right now in Australia, like how we're really trying to be much more engaged with Southeast Asia, for example, the Australian, the Asian century, and all like other agendas, like the New Colombo Plan Scholarship, which is a university program, and like the Blue Pacific. So I just think, yes, space can really feed into like larger government policy projects that are regionally focused.
yeah, and you've hit the nail on the head there. This is not about putting space at the top of the list or the top of the agenda. It's about how space can enable all of those things that we and our neighbours are committed to. And it just has to be inserted in there the way that we already see AI and quantum and chips and critical minerals. And like all of this is just part of how we're thinking about all of these partnerships in this Asian century, in this multipolar era. Space just has to be along the list there. And you mentioned, so when you're talking about the younger nations, I thought you meant in terms of their identity as a nation, so
Oh,
decolonization in
like
the
age,
1950s and 60s, but the
yeah,
age of the
age,
population,
yeah.
I mean, that's going to, particularly if you're thinking across so ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, I'm sure that's, I wonder what the age population is in India, for example. Like these are the innovation centers. Thailand is where we're seeing all of these chips for AI being developed. Like the crux of everything is in this part of the world. But that's fascinating about age, isn't it? Because an aging population is not going to be innovating. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
and again, with the whole with the thing on age, right? Again, when I was in Cambodia, I was really fascinated by, even though I was working in a in the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, I was very lucky to spend a lot of time like out and about and talking to colleagues and friends who are working in these spaces. Like it was just really interesting to see the whole culture and attitude towards like funding, like not I want to say entrepreneurship, a lot of these tech starter like research grant, like even it's quite basic, but there I could really feel an appetite to really surge up a lot of these emerging industries. I don't know, it's interesting.
yeah, I know that's the case in Singapore for space, for example, because the only reason the government started to focus on space was because there was an industry already emerging. There were startups just going ahead and doing it, and the government, decided, well, we need to give a focus to this. So they've been doing some really great stuff in Geneva at the UN space security discussions. As has the Philippines has been
Mm.
outstanding as a space diplomat. The Philippines has also set up its space agency or space office, I think, is very much focused on supporting industry. The Philippines has support from their head of state backing everything that their space agency does, which they are consciously, similar to the way that Japan does it, seeing space as part of their opportunity as a nation in the region, starting at the top with this is who we are as a nation, this is who we are in the region, this is how technology feeds into that, this is how space feeds into that. And there's something to be learned for a country like Australia in terms of that model.
I so agree. And two more points I really wanted to add, right? Coming back to like Cambodia, it may interest listeners to know that when I was living in Phnom Penh, I saw many civil society organizations collaborating with like technical assistance agencies. Like Germany
Mm.
and Denmark are very, very active in Cambodia. There's a German organization called GIZ. I don't know what the full German name is, but they're doing a lot of really interesting like EO mapping projects along the Mekong River to track like pollution and like haze and like to increase not increase to support increased livelihood projects for communities who live like on the river. So it's again really interesting to see how EO data fits into like international development, for instance. But yeah, there's many case studies in Southeast Asia as well. And coming back to the broader question of the significance of this theme is, I think the Asia Pacific is a really interesting case study, right? Because I think there's a mix of very established high capability space powers. There's also some countries who are clients or exploring their capabilities,
Mm,
and there's many countries in the middle. So I think there's a really interesting like
mm,
spectrum.
indeed. Absolutely. Just when you were talking about Earth observation and the Mekong River, one of the members of the Australasian Centre for Space Governance, Dr. Christina Griffin, who's at ANU, is doing some amazing research on that, including with partners in a couple of countries in the region, New Zealand as well. So we're going to have her on the podcast. I think either you or I will be interviewing her, still to be decided. But the other thing that you mentioned just then about like the startup culture and the industry end of things. I mean, there's a tectonic shift that's taken place in recent years in terms of the role that industry has to play. No government can do anything in space without industry partners. But at the same time, we can't forget that no single space industry can do much without government as its main client. So it's still the taxpayers' money going into supporting these companies. But corporations, even outside of space capabilities and space sector, corporations are part of the geopolitical stage. Corporations are actors in geopolitical shifts. They determine, they influence laws and policies. They're determining the relationships and the status of various countries. Another statistic that I had before me was in 1980, trade only accounted for 30% of total global GDP. And today it's about 75%.
There you
So
go.
trade has become more important. Services have become more important. We have whole service industries, and space is a service. Every
It is.
capability we've talked about is services that happen to come from satellites. And so if we have to think about trade and economic relationships and link that with diplomatic relationships in the region, one analogy that I often draw, because I did my law studies in Europe, where we learned so much about the project of the European Union. It was immediately post Second World War. Europe had been completely destroyed, in some cases whole cities destroyed, but certainly the economy was destroyed, massive loss of life, obviously. And so the project to rebuild Europe as a whole, the deliberate decision was, if we can create an internally interdependent market and economy, that will ensure peace, because we're not going to fight our trade partners. And that's why they set up the European Economic Community, which then became the European Union. And part of that was to have a single monetary unit, the euro. It built first on coal and steel, and then it expanded to all these other areas. So it was a conscious decision to say economic and trade interdependency can contribute to peace. Obviously, that was a very specific set of circumstances in a specific period of time in the 20th century. But if you take that sentiment and that knowledge that we tend not to fight our trade partners, look at, Australia's got this constant balancing act with China. Australia recently has refused to take a side when the US said, what would happen if we have World War III? What are you going to do, Australia? And Prime Minister Albanese said, we will decide as and when and if that happens. We're not going to make a statement now, because China is a really important trade partner. We also have a huge population of Chinese Australians. So having, and similarly with India, we're not setting out to compete with them. We're setting out to work together with India. Indonesia as well. We have, somewhat tense relations in the past around Timor-Leste, for example, but we're very keen to balance that with trade and economic and technological partnership. So if we think about wanting to create a more stable Asia-Pacific / Indo-Pacific, that's where technology and trade partnerships are going to contribute. And that's exactly where space technology partnerships should be seen as part of that tapestry.
Yeah, I think I love that point, Cassandra. I think ASEAN, right? I think a lot of political scientists and international relations scholars often compare ASEAN with the European Union. In my view, I feel like they're very different in many ways. I think I think a lot of the countries that formed ASEAN were heavily colonized. So I feel in that sovereignty is a really important topic. So I don't think like ASEAN doesn't have the same like mobility and like borderless like structures that the EU has. For example, there's no human rights court in ASEAN, for example, and there's no forcible binding like dispute resolution like structures in the same way that the EU does. But a lot of researchers have found that science diplomacy and technology diplomacy has been overall, I know there's nuances in this topic, but overall has been quite like desirable among ASEAN countries, and that's
Um,
something that's really happening. And even at the bilateral level, like a lot of like Singapore, Cambodia, like Thailand, Philippines, even within the within ASEAN, there's a lot of partnerships based on technology, and which is so relevant to space.
yeah, no, spot on. So you and I have written a little bit along these lines as well. We've written a couple of op-eds together, and one of them was published last year in the Lowy Institute's online platform that's called The Interpreter. And we wrote it because it was the time that Australia was hosting the Asia Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum, or APRSAF. So Japan, this is very much a soft power or policy lever that Japan uses. It's really the driver behind APRSAF every year, but it's a different country in the region that hosts it. And last year it was Australia. And we wrote a piece that was titled "Working Together in Space Can Enhance Worldly Ties Between Australia and Japan, and the region stands to benefit too." So I just wanted to point to that because I think we covered very similar arguments to what we just discussed, but we really highlighted Japan's role as a spacefaring nation, a leading spacefaring nation. You know, it does very successful launch. It does space robotics. It does space exploration, deep space exploration. It was the first country ever to successfully return a sample from an asteroid. So the Hayabusa mission, they were able to extract a sample, return it to Earth. And then Australia, the Australian Space Agency, partnered with JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, to have that return happen on Australian territory in Australia. So it's exceptional at the kind of scientific end, but also at the policy end of things, because it really nurtures its space economy as much as it nurtures its space science and R&D. And, you know, what you just said about science diplomacy, Japan really holds itself up as a leader in that respect, I think. And its national space policy does the same thing. I think, having spoken to a Japanese professor at ANU who was part of the Hayabusa mission, Professor Junichiro Kawaguchi, so he was one of the lead scientists on the Hayabusa mission, and he told me that most Japanese citizens are very proud of that heritage. They're very aware of it, and they're very proud of the science heritage, the science that they do in space. And so that's built into their identity. And then so their national space policy, as I mentioned before, starts with this high level. This is who Japan is as a nation. These are our aspirations in the region as a middle power. And this is how space fits into that, and it communicates that to the public. It also does things like going around to different industries and users and researchers and saying, how do you use Earth observation data? Tell us how you use this data. And based on that, we will update our missions, or we'll provide different kinds of data, or we'll develop our next mission based on what the users need. Radical concept, but there we go.
Yeah, and I think 2 points on that, Cassandra. Yeah, I love that point that you made. I think that comes back to the bigger question that you and I have spoken about a lot, is the idea of space literacy. Like, even though I don't have the statistics in front of me right now, but I think, like, how do we meaningfully communicate it to society at large on why space is important and worth thinking about and worth investing in? So I think looking at Japan and other countries could be really valuable to see how it's been messaged to the population.
Just to jump in, because the ACSG has undertook in 2023 the first ever comprehensive public opinion poll of what Australians understand about space and think about space, and we learned so much from that, so much rich data. And in 2025, the report will have just been released, probably by the time you're listening to this podcast episode, of an update of that. So rerunning that same thing to understand how successful is government and the space agency and the industry at messaging the public about how important space is. What do they understand about it? What do they think about it? Do they think we should be spending money on it or not? And so that until we understand what the population does or doesn't understand or think about space, we can't really measure the success of that messaging. But certainly what we know is, if we're only messaging that astronauts and rockets are cool, that doesn't land for most countries in this region who don't have that existing capability. Or there are Japanese taikonauts, for example, but most countries are not thinking about launching astronauts into space. They're thinking about Earth observation data and communications.
To build onto that, right, I feel like, for me, a bigger reflection I have on this topic of space literacy is, like, I think developing like substantive space law, like instruments, regulations, and governance structures are important, but equally at the same time, I think the science communication aspect is also
Mm.
extremely important. So how do we get the buy-in from society, right? Like I think right now we have a lot of issues, like cost of living crisis that's going on in Australia. So how do we really like message that well? And I think on the second point, using Japan as a case study, but I really want to use this as a describe this as like a symbol of what's possible with space diplomacy. Like when Japan like did the return launch capsule, and Cassandra, please correct me if I get the names wrong. When Japan did the return launch capsule to Australia, it required exceptional levels of coordination between the Japanese government and the Australian Space Agency and other Commonwealth departments. So again, I think that's really emblematic of the potential that space diplomacy can bring.
Yeah, that's so true. It's so true because I still think that's a little bit disjointed in Australia, which again, we can learn from the Philippines and South Korea and Japan in particular, um, where their space agencies are really clear that what they're doing isn't just about space. They're really clear that they work very closely with their foreign affairs counterparts, for example. I know in Japan and JAXA, space security is folded into the civil space agency. They don't have this kind of false dichotomy.
Yeah.
In the Philippines, they are hosting in 2025 the Asia Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum, the APRSAF. And in 2026, they're hosting ASEAN. And they've been working on developing an ASEAN regional statement on
Right.
sustainability in space. So what is an ASEAN perspective on this? Because we've got the European Space Agency Zero Debris Charter, we've got Europe really leaning into being a leader on space sustainability. So the Philippines has said, well, what is our perspective on this? The Philippines has also made amazing statements and submissions in Geneva around the space arms control and space security discussions, sometimes in partnership with a country like Germany, sometimes independently. So they're really leaning into, they're not an enormous country, significant population, but I mean, they're certainly not a greater power, but they are really leaning into what can be achieved when you identify particular areas, because they're not trying to do everything in space. They're just very clear that this feeds into their ambitions and identity in the region.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I think this can happen at both levels, right? I think at the regional level, I think the scale and the opportunities are really worthwhile. And also at the same time, equally, I think space can also be integrated like further within bilateral relationships as well.
Mm.
Another thing I wanted to add on this topic of like space literacy and being a bit more aspirational of positioning ourselves at the regional level is I don't know, Cassandra, I want to hear your thoughts on this, but I feel after living overseas for a bit, I still feel like Australia has a little bit of the small island mentality that we're really far away from the rest of the world. So therefore we don't need to learn like languages and we don't have to be as involved with what's going on like in other parts of the world. I don't know, I can't help to feel that type of thinking does manifest a little bit in terms of how we think about our potential with space diplomacy and what we do with our international partners. Like Cassandra, I'm really curious to see if you've had any views on this topic.
Yeah, no, that I think that's really astute, and you can only reflect on it when you have lived in other countries, right? Like, so in the countries where you've studied and worked and visited, Singapore and Cambodia and Myanmar, did you not have that sense when you were there that these people thought of themselves as a small island or
No,
a
like it's
limited country in there? Yeah.
like very keen to like learn about like other cultures, languages, like explore partnerships and really, really like the sense of being much more like enthusiastic about working together as like a bigger picture. But I don't really get that sense in Australia. I don't know.
Mm.
Just food for thought.
Yeah, I mean, obviously living in Europe, there are so many countries bordering each other. I mean, I lived in the Netherlands for 16 years, which is smaller than Kakadu National Park in the north of Australia, and has,
Oh wow.
something. Yeah, it is, and it has something like 20 times the, or I don't even know what the numbers are, but the population density in such a small country, obviously, compared to Australia, where it's one person per several square kilometres. And so by definition, everyone in Europe speaks more than one language. You can travel for 2 hours and you're in another country which has a different history and
Writing system.
identity and constitution, and exactly. And up until 2000 had its own currency as well. So that forces, and we talked about the project of the EU, like it has its failings as well, of course, but the project was to build a European bloc, and that I think is also going to take on once again a very important role in this multipolar era. So how do you balance differences, but you have to have cooperation? But there's just a genuine, I think once you grow up around you, you're interested in other cultures and languages. Australia's a massive island. I guess smaller island nations have to think more by definition about what they can do in partnership with others because they can't do everything alone. Even New Zealand does that better than us. Australia's a massive island, so it has an island mentality. It's quite colloquial, and yet it's looked upon as a balancing middle power in the region. But middle power is not a comfortable term across Australian government unless you're in defence. It's a very uncomfortable term, and I think a lot of Australians, depending how many generations they've been in Australia, have difficulty thinking of themselves as taking some kind of leadership role or sticking their neck out. So again, I wonder how that's going to change as our demographic continues to change. We've recently had, I think in the 80s, there was a huge wave of Japanese immigration. There would have been waves of Chinese immigration in the early 2000s. We've got Indian immigration waves happening recently. I'm hoping that has, and it already does have, an influence on what it is to be Australian, what it is we are already multilingual. It's just that to be Australian is to be monolingual. So yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a kind of, there's some growing up Australia has to do in this century.
So I feel like this thinking does have real implications on how we think about like foreign policy and how we see ourselves in the world. But yeah, great point, Cassandra.
Yeah, and well, great point, Andre. Thank you for raising it. And I think that goes again to why space in Asia Pacific is a theme, why we've got a new name for the centre, is that this is not about Australia in the region. It's about space and partnerships in this region, of which Australia is one part. So it's not looking out from Australia. It's really, what can we be doing in partnership? What can we all be learning from each other? I mean, we've mentioned the Philippines and Japan several times. CSIRO, for example, in Australia is very keen to develop a regional Earth observation program called AquaWatch, specifically for tracking the health of freshwater bodies in our region, which are different from massive freshwater bodies in North America, for example. Australia can't do that on its own and isn't even in a position to lead it. So there might be another country willing to lead that. I think we need to be shifting the conversation away from Australia in the Asia Pacific to just being Asia Pacific, which is the point of this whole theme of podcast episodes that we're going to be developing. Based on this conversation, I mean, I was already excited, but such a rich conversation with you. I'm really excited that you're going to be hosting a lot of the guests for that thematic series. But I think you bring, given the different places that you've lived, given where you are in terms of your stage of your career, early career is a really exciting time to be testing out ideas and challenging ideas and pushing people on their ideas. So I really look forward to listening to these episodes that you're going to be leading.
Thank you, Cassandra.
Thanks, Andre. The Space Governance podcast is supported by research funds of the Australasian Centre for Space Governance and is produced by Amelia Taylor. You can find out more about today's guest in our show notes, and you can follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and Instagram. Watch this podcast video on YouTube or listen on your favourite podcasting platform. And if you have suggestions of topics or guests that you'd like us to speak about and with, please contact us via LinkedIn, Blue Sky, or Instagram.